Aloha mai kako, and welcome to this panel discussion titled The UN's Mistake, Self-Determination in Hawaii. This presentation is for the United Nations Human Rights Council 47th session from 21 June through 13 July in the year 2021. It is under the auspices of Incomindios, a non-governmental organization in consultative status with the Economic and Security Council of the United Nations. It is also co-sponsored by the Kiwani Foundation. In 1959, the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 1469 under the mistaken belief that the people of Hawaii had exercised their right to self-determination and consented to be integrated into the United States of America. The error aided and abetted the United States in its subjugation and pillaging of the people and lands of the Hawaiian Islands, causing serious injury and trauma to 3 generations of Hawaiians, depriving them of their right to self-determination and access to and use of their lands and resources. This panel asserts it is time for the UN to meet its obligation to correct its error and ensure just remedy for the 60 years of abuses of the human, civil, political, and developmental rights of the people of the Hawaiian Islands. I am Robert Kajiwara, President of the Peace for Okinawa Coalition and a special envoy of the Hawaiian Kingdom. I will be your moderator for this panel discussion. Our first panelist is H.E. Leon Kaulahao Siu, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Hawaiian Kingdom and a prominent advocate and spokesperson for Hawaii's independence. Minister Siu is a frequent participant at the Human Rights Council and other UN bodies working to normalize the Hawaiian Kingdom's international relations. He is the founder of the Decolonization Alliance based in New York City and was nominated for the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. Minister Siu, thank you for joining us today.
Well, mahalo nui loa. Good to be here. Mahalo for bringing this topic to the forefront. I'm very, very pleased that we're able to report some progress in this area. So just to fill in a little bit more about the background of what happened here. In 1898, the United States acted to annex the Hawaiian Islands without the consent of the people of the Hawaiian Islands. It was simply a unilateral annexation. And it was done so for military advantage. The United States was wanting to build a military outpost here in the Hawaiian Islands, which they did. And the U.S. proceeded to not only build a military outpost, but to really strengthen it and to expand it so that they could project their power into the Western Pacific. And meanwhile, the sugar planters increased in their activities as well and became extremely wealthy during this period of time using Hawaiian lands. So lands were misappropriated under the territory of Hawaii, taken by sugar planters and other commercial interests and used for the commercial interests of those companies and those individuals, mostly white individuals living in Hawaii. So there was a huge disparity between the haves and the have-nots, so to speak, that the Hawaiians were pushed further and further onto the fringes and into the background of Hawaiian society. So that lasted for quite a number of years. And during that period of time, the United States spent a lot of time and as well in conjunction with the territorial government they had installed to indoctrinate particularly the children of Hawaii into believing that Hawaii was part of the United States, that Hawaii had willingly joined the United States as a territory, and that everyone was better off to be under the United States and under U.S. rule. This prevailed for several generations, and of course, World War II came along, and Hawaii was very much involved in that because of, again, the military location and the bases that Hawaii contained at the time, Pearl Harbor and Hickam Air Force Base, etc. So the World War II war in the Pacific was heavily dependent upon the United States occupation and militarization of the Hawaiian Islands. So today, or in 1959, there was, well, after the World War II, the United Nations was formed, and the United Nations sought to do two things. One was try to settle disputes, any future disputes, through peaceful means, and that was the major objective of the United Nations. The second was to decolonize the world. In other words, they were looking at the world, and at post-World War II, there were a few sovereign countries, about 50 of them, and the rest of the world were colonies of the others, or of several of the others. And so to decolonize the world, the UN created a list of non-self-governing territories with the agreement of the governing territories, or the governing states, or administrative states, they were called. And those administrative states submitted the colonies to the United Nations onto a list that said basically that these countries or these territories were eligible for decolonization. That is, that they were eligible to be brought up to the point by the administrative powers so that they could make a determination, a self-determination of the future of their own country. That is, they could decide what kind of government they wanted to have for their future. So the decolonization process was a very innovative thing, and it created a means by which countries could now work their way into becoming independent or dependent, more dependent if they wanted to. So when that started, there several countries, of course, took advantage of that. And as 1960 grew closer, the United Nations decided that they needed to formalize this and create more of a mechanism to assist in the decolonization process. Because prior to that, all of the decolonization was going through the General Assembly. And that was kind of time consuming and all that. So they created, or they were set to create, a mechanism which eventually became known as the Decolonization Committee, or actually had a much longer name, but basically it was short named the Decolonization Committee. But that didn't come about until 1961. In 1960 was when the General Assembly acted on a resolution to create this committee. The committee didn't actually go into effect until 1961. But in 1959, 58 and 59, the United States, realizing that they had two territories on the list of non-self-governing territories, Alaska and Hawaii, which they did not want to submit to the decolonization process. So the idea that they had was to remove these territories from the list before a formal decolonization process was adopted by the General Assembly. And so in 1958, a plebiscite was held, a referendum was held in Alaska. And in 1959, a similar referendum was held in Hawaii. And in both of those referenda, the United States conducted those referenda, but they manipulated it to the point where they actually falsified the outcome of the referenda. Initially, the two main things that they did was that they allowed US citizens in Alaska and Hawaii to vote. They actually excluded the local populations of those that would have considered themselves Alaskan nationals or Hawaiian nationals. They were excluded from voting because they were not US citizens. But the other part was that they only put one real question on the ballot, which was, do you want to become a state of the United States? So in both cases, Alaska and Hawaii, the ballot was rigged. And it was rigged for one outcome, and that was the choice of statehood. So naturally, when the election was held, there was a large majority of the people in both Alaska and Hawaii voted for statehood, respectively. But what happened with Hawaii and Alaska was then that this was reported to the General Assembly in 1959. A report was sent in September of 1959, and the General Assembly acted on the report. And the General Assembly basically said that they accepted the United States report that Alaska and Hawaii had freely chosen to become part of the United States as integral part of the United States. And so the United Nations removed or passed a resolution called 1469, in which they removed Hawaii and Alaska from the list of non-self-governing territories, basically indicating that the question of the future governance and the status, the political status of the Hawaiian Islands and Alaska now were settled, that the people had made a determination that they would become part of the United States. So here in Hawaii, that was, of course, a real travesty because we never even belonged on the list of non-self-governing territories, except for the fraud of the United States. So they had placed us into a position in which they could capture us with the help of the United Nations. And that's what happened. So the United Nations actually inadvertently became complicit in the United States claim to the Hawaiian Islands, which was a false claim based on previous false claims. So that's where we are. That's what happened with Resolution 1469. The ironic thing about this is that the United Nations, which is dedicated for the process of self-determination and decolonization, actually assisted in the capturing or the further subjection of the Hawaiian Islands to the United States. So they inadvertently actually did the opposite of what they intended to do with Hawaii as a non-self-governing territory. So we're in a situation right now where we're saying that what we need to do, and I'll explain a little bit more later, what we need to do is to reverse the decision that was made by the General Assembly in their adoption of 1469, and to point out that they had acted in error and to have them rescind that error. So that's the basic history.
Thank you, Minister Siu. For more on UNGA Resolution 1469, we now turn to Ambassador Isaias Medina III, Ambassador at Large for the Kingdom of the Hawaiian Islands. He is also a Public Policy and Management Edward S. Mason Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He is an international lawyer, a former diplomat at the UN Security Council, and an environmental and humanitarian activist. He is president of the International Sustainable Development Corporation with 35.7 million acres of pristine indigenous lands under its preservation and management. He is a member of the International Bar Association in London, England, Latin American International Law Society, the American Society of International Law, the Inter-American Bar Association, and the Academic Council on the United Nations System. Ambassador Medina, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Robert, and thank God Almighty for allowing me to share with you both. For the three of us today here is really an honor and a privilege to be part of this wonderful panel with my distinguished Minister of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Leon Sui, and of course, the distinguished Madam Routh Bolomet. My sincere respect and admiration to you all, and also thanks to the sponsors for making this possible. Well, after that wonderful recollection of historic recollection at the United Nations on what has happened, I would like to express at the outset, in my personal capacity, that I believe there are many differences between what happened in the 1890s and what has slowly been developing in the 20th century. Let's just, for the sake of argument, look at the U.S. administration in regards to the Kingdom of the Hawaiian Islands, including President Clinton's apology, joint resolution of the U.S. Congress adopted in 1993 that acknowledges the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii, just like, of course, it was also recognized during that time. But in contrast to what President Eisenhower's administration in 1959 and the position that was presented to the UN General Assembly, who adopted the Resolution 1469, relieving the U.S. from the reporting requirements under the UN Charter Article 73, specifically letter E, after allegedly having found that the people of the territory under colonization had supposedly exercised self-government by choosing to become a state of the United States of America. And with all due respect, it was actually completely the opposite. And towards the explanation of what happened with that, let's call it plebiscite, for lack of a better word, but the inclusion to begin with of Hawaii on the United Nations list of non-self-governing territories was completely inaccurate depiction of a sovereign state whose rights had been completely violated under an illegal occupation. But also Hawaii, and we must understand this, continues to be a sovereign and independent state, despite the illegal overthrow of its government in 1893 and the prolonged and protracted illegal occupation of its territory since 1898. So there are several concerns with UNGA Resolution 1469, for example, the blatant breach for self-determination in the statehood referendum is that the people of Hawaii that voted were the wrong people of Hawaii. It was not the Hawaiian descendants who were offered the vote of statehood. Accordingly, the referendum being offered to someone else than the right people of Hawaii is then null and void. Ratione persona. This is a legal term that will explain that the wrong people actually were the ones who participated. If we look at that, the US ignored the fact that this vote for self-determination needed to be held among the descendants of subjects of the taken over and occupied Hawaiian nation. Instead, the entire populace at that time, which of course the settler population in the 1950s far surpassed the number of the kingdom descendants, which in 40 years were reduced 85% due to the fact that there were many illnesses brought by foreigners during the 1900s. And in 40 years, there was only 15% of the original nationals of the kingdom left to participate. But in this case, even the US military personnel and their dependents stationed in Hawaii for at least 1 year were able to vote. So however, since only US citizens could vote, this renders the so-called referendum null and void twice. So another issue that we can certainly comment is the actual self-governance was never presented to the public as a possibility, much less as an option, which deemed the plebiscite illegitimate because there was no real option for independence. The ballot question did not conform to essential UN requirements, just like Minister Siu was mentioning. The question was only one, and the answer was pretty clear. The question was, shall Hawaii immediately be admitted into the Union as a state? So the only answer was either yes or no. Thus, the only choices were either to become a state within the United States of America or to remain a territory of the United States of America. So really, there is no choice for independence. There was no choice for becoming independent of the United States or to even have some other relationship with the United States. This is important to mention because the UN Resolution 742 of 1953 declared that one of the main factors indicative of the attainment of independence or of other separate systems of self-government is freedom of choosing between several possibilities, including independence. The ballot, as written, did not comply with the UN requirements and clearly prevented voters from effectively exercising their right to self-determination. Further, at the time of the vote, almost no one knew that there were alternatives to integration into the U.S. that should have been included on the ballot. Alternatives such as, this is as an example, independence or free association with the U.S. Another issue was hiding thorough cultural indoctrination of the true history of Hawaii from voters for many years, preventing the informed consent they needed to freely choose and cast a valid vote. Let me give you an example of that. History was taught in a way that avoided mentioning the landing of American troops and the overthrow of the Queen, the overthrow and ugly events leading up to the surrounding of the annexation were avoided in school texts, and they also eliminated the Hawaiian language from schools. Another issue important to mention here is that the U.S. falsely reported 94% yes vote regarding statehood, even though in this most important election ever held in Hawaii, 65% of the people of voting age stayed away from the polls, which resulted in less than 50% of the required participation, also rendering the vote null and void. So if we look at the different issues that are to be considered that these votes were null and void, that would make the whole report completely different than what it was presented. So individual and even more so collective, all of the above problems with the 1959 Hawaii plebiscite on statehood renders it invalid and should be thoroughly reviewed by the UNGA to correct the mistake of adopting a resolution under erroneous representations. So in the name of justice and fairness to the UN Charter and to all sovereign nations of its membership as a whole, these mistakes must be amended. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Medina. Next, we would like to examine the impact of U.S. occupation in Hawaii and specifically towards Hawaiian nationals. Of course, this is a huge topic of discussion, and we could not possibly cover everything in one panel presentation. But we would still like to examine a little bit of what the impact has been. For more on this, we turn to Madam Routh Bolomet, a descendant of the royal line of Kamehameha, the original rulers of the Hawaiian kingdom. As such, she is an heir to the privately held lands of the Kamehamehas and other private allodial title royal patent lands. She advocates for the repatriation of lands that were taken and being sold illegally under the puppet regimes of the United States territory of Hawaii and the state of Hawaii. Madam Bolomet, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Aloha, everybody. Mahalo nui loa for allowing me to participate in this panel discussion with all the esteemed panelists. So I'm honored to be here. What I'm finding is, as our people have gone through the last 62 years of being definitely under the United States, supposedly as a state, and I say supposedly because it's only because we have not been fully educated to this fact that everybody's working off the assumption that the Hawaiian Islands are the 50th state. So when we go back to looking at the courts applying their laws and asserting their laws upon these lands, essentially they're asserting it upon the contracts made illegally without consent to the allodial title heirs and descendants, and they're doing it on the warranty deeds and contracts for loans that are attaching the allodial title lands to the warranty deeds, the color of title deeds. Now, what I found interesting about this is when people are losing their lands, whether they be the private lands or the crown lands, they're doing it by the U.S. and these loans and these liens that are put on the color of title. When they don't identify the heirs to be a part of a court case, then essentially they say, well, there's nobody here to speak for the allodial titles, and because of that, we are going to default any other claims, and we give these lands to the bank, you know, in the sense of a foreclosure, or to the person making the claim in a quiet title action. So the people are constantly having their lands stolen from them simply because we don't understand the system that's being applied, because the laws that actually are applied to these lands are not what's being exercised in the courts. They're being sidestepped, and they're not being overlooked. They know what the laws are because we're giving them the laws that are applicable to this. My concern up till now is the impacts of the United States taking over the Hawaiian Islands, besides military, besides lands, is we have our ecosystem being challenged on levels that most people aren't aware of. Our health for our people are challenged simply because we have U.S. policy dictating what can and can't be done within our environment. And for instance, the Hawaiian Islands are used, and at one point was the largest grower of GMO seeds. I think there was like 1/3 of all GMO seeds were grown in the Hawaiian Islands. And nobody asked the people here if they could do that. They just did it. And as a result, we have many people that have gotten sick from the chemicals, and we're having to find ways to clean our soil. But as long as there's deals being made, corporate deals being made between the U.S. And other corporations, whether they be foreign or U.S. corporations, which essentially is foreign to the Hawaiian Islands, the people are being used as guinea pigs, essentially, where all these chemicals that affect their health, you can see the long-term effects by the health statistics. And one of my good friends, who is an emergency room doctor who did a lot of focused work on thyroid, said the Hawaiian Islands had 17% higher cancer, thyroid cancer, than any other state in the United States. And so, you know, we are being impacted on so many levels, but my biggest concern is land, health, our water. And that's where I think we can start, besides all the other things that we've worked on with demilitarization and that sort of thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Bolomet. Would any of our other panelists like to comment on this topic of the impact of U.S. occupation in Hawaii?
Yes, I would. Thank you so much, Ruth, for that really wonderful presentation. The issue of the separation of the people from their land is a very, very powerful one, in the fact that, you know, people, particularly in Hawaii and in other places of indigenous peoples, they are very much attached to the land. There's a symbiotic relationship with the land, with their God, and with the people. And without one of those factors, the land, it actually puts the people at a very, very disadvantaged, as well as a very risky situation. So when our people have been, because our people have been separated from our own lands, there are many, many consequences to that, which are very, very evident in our society today. That is, our people are suffering from, as Ruth said, health problems, but not just health problems. There's an overriding feeling of separation. That is, it's more of a consciousness that has been severely harmed, because we know we belong here, but we're not treated as if we belong here. And we're not allowed the resources and the ability to really do what we need to do, which is to take care of our land so that our land takes care of us. So that relationship has been broken. And it's a very deep wound that has happened in our people, to which many of our people are very much struggling, as well as many have, just really succumbed to the frustrations and the loss of their ability to commune with their land and to work with their land and to thrive alongside with their land. So this is a systemic problem here in Hawaii because of the land separation, not just the government on jurisdiction and things like that. It's really the physical separation from our own land has a profound effect on the psyche and on the health of our people.
Yes, Ambassador Medina.
Well, first of all, thank you to you both. It's wonderful to hear your perspective. It's so humane, and it really is by living the experience on how this has affected, of course, Hawaiian nationals like yourselves. But in my humble opinion, I want to see the perspective that, as I understand, the Kingdom of Hawaii was actually recognized by the international community, and in the 1800s has the highest literacy rate around the world, I think around 98%. It had 38 different newspapers in the Hawaiian language, and it was a thriving, happy, beautiful nation, recognized as such by the president of the US at that time. And today, as you can see, the difficulties of being illegally occupied and being set aside as nationals and being considered either you become a US citizen or you will be pushed into homelessness. They have been pushed into very high difficulties in education because they've lost the whole possibility of practicing their own language in schools. The old schools have been taken by new names of different US presidents instead of the rulers, original rulers of the kingdom. And all this have brought up loss of national identity, the loss of a native original language, the culture, and of course resources and environmental different attacks into the land and into the ways of the relationship of individuals with the land. I mean, actually, the Polynesians were born out of the father, the son, and the mother, the earth. And now to see their own land being pillaged and being taken away from them and their rights, like Leon was saying, it's heartbroken. They are heartbroken, but there is a possibility to retake, the dignity that has been ripped away, and also the endangered that has been brought by one of the highest military forces around the earth, and in particular, to have to become a target for nuclear attacks must also be a very difficult situation psychologically and emotionally for the nationals of the Kingdom of the Hawaiian Islands. And that's why you can see how many resolutions were in accordance to protecting the cultural heritage, to protecting the well-being and the good health of the people under this administration or colonization. In this case, regrettably, I think the US has failed with this duty that they had as an administrative power. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you to all three of you for a lively and interesting discussion on that. Next, I would like to share something with you. On May 31st of this year, the UN Geneva tweeted something on their official Twitter account at UN Geneva. I'll read it for you. It says, quote, "When the UN was founded in 1945, some 750 million people, or 1/3 of the world's population, lived in territories dependent on colonial powers. Today, fewer than 2 million people live under colonial rule in 17 remaining non-self-governing territories.
Mhm.
Was wondering if any of you would like to share your thoughts on this.
Well, yes, I would like to. Of course, that is the official UN figures, which only represents what the UN sees and what's being reported by the states. But there are many, many more than 17 peoples and nations that are striving, or that should be on the list of non-self-governing territories, or actually maybe shouldn't be because they are already our sovereign nations, like Hawaii. And so the figures are very much deceptive because they represent only one interpretation, the United Nations, and one identity as far as how they identify which peoples are in nations that are which nations are free and or not. Because there are, of course, many, many nations, and the United States and Canada, have together 1,200 nations within their boundaries. And many of those nations don't consider themselves part of those countries. So the estimation by the UN is only being reported according to its own standards and its own parameters, and not the reality of what's going on in the world.
As Ambassador Medina.
Oh, if I may, and thank you so much, Robert and Leon, for your previous comment. Around the world, there's 370 million indigenous people. That's the population estimated. Now I ask you, and this is a question for all your audience, how many of those indigenous nations, which were original First Nations, are today under a functioning sovereign government? That is the question that we should be asking ourselves. Within 25 to 30% of the territory around the world that is under the stewardship of indigenous nations, there lies 80% of our biodiversity. Our biodiversity, who today under outside the indigenous nations, is at the gate of the 6th largest mass extinction event in history because of the degradation of the environment that we managed to achieve in more than 100 years of industrialization. So now that when we look at this, we have to ask ourselves really, what is the right form or the right way to deal with land and with governance of indigenous nations? Because I think, in my opinion, we have a lot to learn from them in the way they live, in the way they harmoniously interact with nation, and in the way they protect and become stewards of their natural environment. So I do also will have to add my opinion that is not the correct statistics, and that we should actually try to ask the indigenous nations if they feel that they are free. And then on the other hand, I also wanted to add that differently than what non-self-government territories are considered, the Kingdom of the Hawaiian Islands was a sovereign nation recognized by 100% of the international community in the 1800s. He was a friend to the United States, and he had, I think, different, not only many treaties, but it also had consular presence all over the world. If I'm not mistaken, please, Leon, correct me, but I think I've read there were 99 different consulates and embassies around the world. Is that correct?
Actually, there were 137. Yes.
So to even fathom the idea that this is a non-self-governing territory is completely outside international law. Mm-hmm. This was a sovereign nation that was illegally occupied by an act of war. And that's what President Cleveland said in its time. So what I do believe that we should be looking at is on how we can come to terms with reality, with the truth and justice, and try to, as we will probably will address on your next question, what are the next steps regarding this Resolution 1469? Thank you, Rob.
if that's a nice segue into the next section, what are our next step? We return to Resolution 1469 of the General Assembly. And that, of course, as we described earlier, really consigned a nation that should have been a free nation. It consigned us to be subsumed by the United States. And the United Nations was partially responsible for that, because it went along with the United States misrepresentation of the realities of on the ground here in Hawaii. And so what we're looking at is to find a way, and we believe we have found a way, to actually start to dismantle that falsehood of Hawaii being a state of the United States. And it seems to us that the linchpin here is Resolution 1469. That is the one thing that's holding the United States claim together, because it has the agreement of the nations of the United Nations that the United States, that Hawaii is part of the United States. It is also the one thing that is preventing us from taking any kind of legal action. And it's a bit of a convoluted, or not, it's a bit of an explanation, but here goes. The acceptance of the United Nations of the report by the United States that Hawaii had chosen to become part of the United States, in essence, was a declaration of a settlement of the question of the sovereignty of the Hawaiian Kingdom, of the Hawaiian Islands. That is, what they said was the people voted and gave their consent to be part of the United States. Therefore, the question of Hawaii's political status was then settled. And that's what the United Nations resolution basically implies, or strongly implies, that the issue was settled by a vote and by the consent of the people. Now, we know that neither the people didn't consent, and the vote was fraudulent. But this is what the official position of the United Nations is, which makes it the official position of all the member states of the United Nations, and makes it the official position of the courts, the international courts that come under the United Nations, as well as the U.S. Supreme Court and the U.S. courts and all the other courts. They are all functioning under the illusion that Hawaii, the political status of Hawaii has been settled, and that Hawaii is part of the United States. Therefore, the implication is also that since the people of Hawaii agreed to becoming part of the United States, they also forfeited the right to bring up any earlier grievances. For instance, the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom or the fake annexation of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Those issues are now undisputable. That is, we can't go back and dispute them in a court of law, because the people themselves, according to the narrative, the people themselves accepted their role as part of the United States. So you can't really go back and say, well, wait a minute, the United States illegally annexed the Hawaiian Islands. That's a moot point at this point. So what this does is it prevents, Resolution 1469 prevents Hawaii from taking any kind of legal action. And this has been borne out by many of the attempts by our people to take legal action in various courts. And in every single situation, except for that one time at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in the year 2000, every single time the courts demurred or actually decided not to take the case. And the reason is because they believe the political question has been settled. So therefore, the political question actually overrides the legal questions. So this is the situation we're in that 1469 prevents us from pursuing any of our legal questions. So 1469 stands in the way, and so we need to find a way to remove 1469. And as I said earlier, we believe we do have a strategy that can work to accomplish that.
Ambassador Medina?
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I could not agree more with what His Excellency, Mr. Leon Siu, has just mentioned. And there is no doubt in my mind that legally there is no doubt of the error, but now politically, which is the political question that Leon is just talking about, it needs to be resolved. And just to make a short explanation about this, I would like to disarticulate two paragraphs of the Resolution 1469, which read, paragraph number 2 is, the General Assembly expresses the opinion based on its examination of the documentation and the explanations provided that the people of Alaska and Hawaii have effectively exercised their right to self-determination and have freely chosen their present status. As we've already talked about, we saw the many different null and void, not only practices, but evidence that are evidence to the contrary of what this paragraph 2 in Resolution 1469 states. Paragraph 3 congratulates the United States of America and the people of Alaska and Hawaii upon the attainment of a full measure of self-government by the people of Alaska and Hawaii. So I do believe that perhaps at that time in 1959, the situation was not such that it allowed the review or the thorough review of the information, and this is why we should bring it back to the General Assembly. Let me just give you a couple of examples. They actually switched the concept of full measure of self-governance as the Article 73 of the UN Charter intended that the descendants of the kingdom be offered independence or some other form of self-governance, separating themselves from the United States. Instead, all the people of Hawaii were offered exactly the opposite, moving from a territory to a state within the United States. Instead of separation, they were given total absorption. And this was passed off as the attainment of a full measure of self-government by the people of Alaska and Hawaii in Resolution 1469. This clearly shows you the importance of this resolution that must be reviewed. In requesting a review of the U.S. compliance with the UN Charter, Article 73, we will ask the reviewers to specially study how the U.S. failed on its administering responsibilities to ensure, with due respect for the culture of the peoples concerned, their political, economic, and social and educational advancement, their just treatment, and their protection against abuses. I close the quotes from Article 73. And how the U.S. failed to develop self-government, both of which were required pursuant to the UN Charter. So if you ask me, what are their next steps? Certainly to adopt a resolution that will be presented in the UNGA for the review of Resolution 1469. This resolution first will ask the General Assembly to order a review of how the U.S. complied with the provisions of Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, particularly Article 73, over the relevant years from 1946, the year in which Hawaii and Alaska were inscribed in the list, wrongly inscribed in the list of non-self-governing territories under GA Resolution 66, until 1959, the year in which the U.S. reported that the people of these territories had exercised their self-determination. It further calls on the General Assembly to initiate a review for the representations made in the report 4226 submitted by the United States on 24th of September of 1959. In compliance to Article 73, in particular, letter E, including the terms and conditions of the plebiscite, and also to review the consequent discussions and procedures that led to the adoption of Resolution 1469. The resolution will call on the UN General Assembly to appoint a commission, a committee, or a special rapporteur to conduct an inquiry to review the factors that led to the adoption of the Resolution 1469 and to ascertain whether the adoption of the resolution legally met the prescriptions of the Article 73 of the UN Charter. How can other countries help? Joining the adoption of the resolution to be presented, because if there is even a shred of possibility that the report was portrayed in an inaccurate manner or misrepresented to achieve its objective under false pretenses, a review process must be open to identify inconsistencies and to recommend the appropriate corrections. Thank you, Robert.
We are coming to a close for this panel discussion. I would like to open it up to closing comments or final thoughts. Madam Bolomet, would you like to share any closing comments or final thoughts?
Yes. First of all, I'm so happy we're having this conversation, because not only do the members of the UN need to understand the full scope of our situation, but our own people, Hawaiian nationals, need to understand the full scope of our situation, all of our rights, and all the laws that actually support our claim to being an independent nation state in continuity. I noticed that our own people, the ones that have gone maybe off path, the ones that are maybe homeless and not doing as well, I think it's because they've lost their sense of identity, because our identities are so ingrained and interwoven into the land, into the water, into our culture, that when that's taken away, we cannot be a whole people. And I ask the UN General Assembly to look deeply into this, because every day that passes, there is harm that's coming to our people, and we're getting further and further away from bringing reconciliation to the people. And everybody deserves to have, and that's what the UN says. We deserve to go home. We deserve to have our culture, and we deserve to be the people that we are, not the reflection of our oppressors and those that try to make us into something or a reflection of themselves. We are Kanaka Maoli, and we want our home back and our nation back. Thank you.
Yo.
Thank you, Madam Bolomet. Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your insights. Ambassador Medina, any closing comments or final thoughts?
Yes. First of all, I would be remiss if I did not thank you, Madam Bolomet, and of course, Minister Siu, on everything that you have said in representation of your people. And I would like to appeal to the international community, to each and every nation that it believes themselves to be sovereign, that the sovereignty for the nationals of the Kingdom of the Nine Islands is no different. It's no different than your sovereignty. And it's a human right for them to be able to represent what they were in the 1800s to come back now. And that's why I am so looking forward to engage with each and every nation, with each and every ambassador to the United Nations, and with the Secretariat, to explain the importance. This is fundamental. It's fundamental for international relations. It's fundamental for international law. And it's fundamental for the belief in the truth, in the pillars of the UN Charter, to review Resolution 1469 and to amend the errors of the past, and to open a bright new future for the nationals of the Kingdom of the Hawaiian Islands. And I thank you very much for the opportunity, Robert, and for you as well.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Medina. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for your expertise. Minister Siu, closing comments or final thoughts?
Yes. Yes, first of all, I'd like to thank Madame Bolomet as well as Ambassador Medina for joining us here today. It has been a very, very stimulating time, and I just really appreciate what you both brought to the table today. It just really is encouraging to me that we do have a team of people like you and many others around us who have given this not only their thoughts but has given their heart to this cause. And so I really want to thank you all for that. And I want to also thank those who are listening to this presentation, and I hope that this touches you as well. We are looking for assistance from nation states of the United Nations to bring before the United Nations a request for a review of Resolution 1469. So we will be calling upon you to be talking about this. And many of you have already expressed an interest, so we're going to be pursuing that. We're expecting that within this next few months that we will be able to actually bring forward a resolution to present before the General Assembly to begin the process of reviewing 1469. So mahalo nui, aloha everyone, aloha nui loa.
Thank you very much, Minister Siu. Thank you for joining us today and for sharing your insights. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for taking the time to join us today. This concludes our panel discussion. We would like to thank again the United Nations Human Rights Council for allowing us to speak today. Thank you so much to Encomendios for sponsoring this event. Thank you also to co-sponsor the Kuani Foundation. And thank you to all of our viewers watching. For more information, please check out the website hawaiiankingdom.net. Aloha, mahalo nui loa, and a hui hou. Until we meet again.
Aloha.
Aloha.